It's such an honor to be invited to do this. I'm so glad to be here. And I don't understand why I've never been to Columbia before. I mean, I know a lot of people here. Rupik Desai is in the audience, who was with us at the medical college for a while. I know lots of the principals here. I don't know why I've never been. So it's been a delight. I want to start by thanking these collaborators of mine. Lisa Conant was a dear collaborator of ours, and Rupik's as well, who passed away from a long illness late last year, and we miss her greatly. Leo Fernandino is a principal in the lab, as is Bill Gross, and they both work in this field. And then Stephen and Tony are graduate students. Tony recently graduated, and I'll be showing a lot of their work as well. So lots to go through. I don't know if I'll get through it all, but we'll see what happens. Probably I don't need to spend a lot of time on theories of concept representation, but I will talk about that a little bit as an introductory topic. Most of the time, I'll be showing you some fMRI data that we have that adjudicates between the theories, I think, a little bit. And we're very interested in how different categories of concepts are organized in the brain, whether there is any categorical organization in the system. So I'll be talking about different categories of concepts. What is conceptual knowledge? It's generalized knowledge that we acquire as a result of experience. In other words, we encounter the same kinds of things in our daily life over and over, and our brain produces a sort of generalized or schematic representation of those experiences. And there are lots of kinds of concepts, some of which I've listed here, with different properties. Of course, we try to naturally, our brains group concepts by similarity. So cats are similar to other felines, and felines are similar to other kinds of mammals, and so on. And so one of the things that features prominently in the history of studies on conceptual representation is this idea that the brain forms these categories, and that's how the information is organized in the brain. That may or may not be the case, but there's evidence for and against. We kind of know where in the brain semantic processes occur, where concepts are represented, and what brain structures are responsible for retrieving that stored knowledge. And my current picture of this comes from the meta-analysis that Dirk mentioned that we did in 2009 with 120 published studies. So you take 120 published studies, collect all the coordinate peaks of activation that have been reported, and you do a voxel level meta-analysis of those coordinates. And this is the map that results. So it's a left lateralized system, although it's not strictly all 100% left hemisphere. There's some organization in the right hemisphere as well. And it involves a lot of the temporal lobe and a lot of the inferior parietal lobe and some frontal areas as well, IFG and dorsal medial prefrontal cortex. So these are the regions that we kind of, at times, if we're doing a region of interest kind of approach, we focus on these areas. One of the studies I'll show you later used this map actually to create the region of interest. All right, so there are some major questions. How is concept information encoded in this network? Are there functional subdivisions within the network? And finally, how are categories of objects or categories of concepts differentially represented, or are they different? Well, let's see, this is kind of the standard view of the conceptual representation in the brain since the cognitive revolution in the 1950s, which is to say that concepts are thought of as self-contained entities in the brain whose activation is necessary and sufficient to retrieve a concept. So sufficient to retrieve a concept means that there are, in this sense, neural representations that, when activated, result in activation of the concept in the mind. And that's all that's necessary. And these representations don't necessarily contain a lot of sensory detail about an object or an event. And they are said to be, at least by some theorists, symbolic representations. They are related to each other by virtue of habit, experience, similarity perhaps, co-occurrence, and activation spreads throughout the network from one representation to related or connected representations. It's a model that most people consider came out of the computer analogy, the analogy of the human brain with computers, in which systems, in silico systems, concepts are represented in this way as symbols. But that kind of model doesn't tell us anything about how those symbols got there, how those concepts were learned in the first place. If they are stored differentially in different parts of the brain, the model doesn't really tell us why that would be or make any predictions about how the organization would be laid out. So the alternative to that kind of model is that we learn concepts from experience. And the general idea is that we encounter many exemplars of a given object category or action or event or abstract concept. And our sensory systems and our motor systems and our affective systems extract commonalities from across those different example experiences and assemble them together, whether that's a local assembly or a distributed assembly, into a abstraction is one way to think of it. A schematic version of the many experiences that we've had. This is an example that's kind of presented in the visual modality, but we assume that similar abstraction, schematization, generalization processes occur in all the modalities of experience, of which there are many. I mean, I've mentioned vision, but even within vision, you can talk about color experiences, shape experiences, visual motion experiences, size experiences, location experiences, and so on. And then there are all the other modalities of sensory information processing. So this leads us to the alternative theory, which we call experiential theory. It's also been called embodiment theory, grounded theory, which is the concepts or generalizations of experiences. And so, for example, the concept of a domestic cat is represented by its sensory attributes, which are presumably all processed by different brain systems and stored in somewhat different locations. Behavioral attributes of the object, action and manipulation experiences associated with it, and emotional experiences. So among others, the list goes on. And concepts are stored in the brain as combinations of these kinds of experiential content. Concept retrieval then involves reactivating the experiential content. So I listed Wernicke as one of the proponents of this view, and people don't realize this really about Wernicke's model, but his original paper in 1874 became famous for this picture, which shows A, or alpha 1, as the center for word sound images, which eventually became known as Wernicke's area. People don't pay as much attention to this figure, which was in the same paper, in which he showed, in addition, a center for tactile memory images and optical or visual memory images, and said that the concept is nothing more than the connection between C and D. So it's very similar to the view that I just expressed about experiential learning, experience-based representation. This is a famous model of semantic processing called the hub and spoke model. It comes from studies of patients with semantic variant progressive aphasia, primary progressive aphasia, or semantic dementia. And it pictures a modal hub in the anterior temporal lobe, where these symbolic or amodal representations of concepts are stored. They make contact with experiential information sensory details, for example, that are stored elsewhere in modality-specific parts of the brain, which are indicated by the different colored circles. Rudvik and I actually published this model, which is a variation of what we call the convergence zone model, which differs from this hub and spoke model in the sense that the convergence areas, the highest areas where the most abstract kinds of conceptual material are stored, are not amodal, they're multimodal, which is a distinction that I'll go into more in a bit. And they're not restricted to the ATL. So this model comes from, well, the meta-analysis data that I showed you before, but also from lesion studies over the years, and functional imaging data. All right, so I'll tell you about the fMRI data set that we're gonna concern ourselves with the rest of the talk. This is a study that was funded, and we thank the NIECD for this funding, and has been carried out over the last 5 years or so. It really consists of 2 separate data sets, but sometimes we combine them together into larger analyses. And I want to try and express the extent and the depth of this data set. It's a very large data set, 80 young adults, kind of standard acquisitions. This was a multi-band acquisition, so the voxels are maybe a little smaller than you might be used to. Each person in the data set went through 3 different scanning sessions. So they came in on 3 different days so that we could expose them to all the words in the stimulus set 6 times. So it's a very large data set in that sense. There's also quite a number of words in each experiment, 300 words in one, 320 in the other. And these are all nouns from different conceptual categories with 40 to 50 items per category. The task was very simple. They saw a printed word on a screen like this, and they had to press one of 3 buttons to indicate how familiar they thought the concept was, or how frequently they encountered this concept in their daily life. These are the categories that we have data on. It doesn't cover the complete semantic space by any means. It's focused on object categories and event categories. There's a human trait category that is in there for because of our interest in social cognition. So these are some of the categories that I'll be talking about later on in the talk. Okay, who's familiar with representational similarity analysis? Is that a fairly, okay, I'm going to go over this. It's really not complicated. It sounds complicated, but it's really not. In representational similarity analysis, the way this experiment is set up, the participant sees multiple items, in this case, multiple different concepts, and in this case, 6 times over 3 different sessions. And a map is created, an activation map is created for each word, a separate activation map. These are very noisy maps in general, but there are enough signal there, it turns out, to do some quite interesting analysis. So what you see depicted schematically in the upper right here is just taking all the voxels that are in space and lining them up as a vector. It doesn't have to be all the voxels in the brain. In fact, it's usually done for a region of interest. But you take all the activated voxels, line them up as a vector, the values that were produced by a given word, and then you have a vector for each word, a vector of activation values. So that can be used to create what's called a neural dissimilarity matrix. So you simply take the correlation between each pair of vectors and subtract that correlation from 1, and that gives you the dissimilarity value between that pair of items. Clear? That's a neural dissimilarity matrix. For representational similarity analysis, then you create the same kind of dissimilarity matrix, but based entirely on a theory of some kind. And it can be any kind of theory, and we'll talk about a number of different kinds. But as long as the model that you're using can express the similarity between any pair of items, that's all you need. Then you can make a matrix of the dissimilarity between the items. It might be based on features, as in this example, or it might be based on something else. For example, in WordNet, if anybody's familiar with that hierarchical taxonomic model, the similarity between items is basically, you can think of it as, remember that diagram of the categories that I showed before? How many steps would you have to go from cat to dog? That's in that hierarchical tree. That's kind of the measure of similarity. And then RSA is basically just, it's this simple. It's correlating the neural dissimilarity matrix with the theoretical dissimilarity matrix. And so if the correlation is high, it indicates that the model contains information that is encoded in the brain, that the same features that are encoded in the model are being encoded in the neural tissue, which is why it's interesting. We also refer to this as model-based RSA to specify that it's based on a model. You can also do these kinds of correlations between dissimilarity matrices from, using neural signals from different species of creature, for example, humans and macaques, which has also been done. But this is a RSA based on model comparisons. All right, so I need to explain to you what the CREA model is, which Rudvik was involved in developing. And this is an experiential model that tries to specify the experiential content of a concept based on what people generally feel is the content. So we have to quantify that. We have to figure out a method for getting people's opinions about content. We have to specify what the features of the model are. So I'll give you an example of one feature in this model. We asked people using a crowdsourcing tool called Amazon Turk. This is just one example. How important is the weight of a thing, or how important is weight to the concept of, I don't know, pick anything. Truck. Well, it's a pretty heavy object. And it distinguishes truck, maybe weight distinguishes truck from other objects, other vehicles. So it's moderately important. We did that for 65 different dimensions like that, weight being one of 65. So here's another illustration of that. If we look at the 5 features, how important is sound experience? How important is color experience, motion, shape, and manipulation experience to the concept of tomato? These are the vectors that we get, and we use a 0 to 6 rating scales, Likert type rating scale. And color turns out to be very important, as intuitively you would think, as does shape. You would also think taste would, but taste wasn't on this list in this early study. And you can think of probably lots of other qualities that tomatoes have that characterize them as tomatoes. So looking across different kinds of concepts, and here are 6 radically different kinds of concepts, you see that these vectors change radically from concept to concept. That's the main point. All right, so Rudvik and Lisa Conant and I developed this model that has 65 dimensions in it, as I mentioned before. 29 of them are have to do with sensory perceptual experiences in all the different modalities of sensory perception. 5 have to do with motor phenomena, action phenomena. For example, one question was, how important are upper limb actions to this concept? Hammer would get a high rating. Soccer ball would get a low rating, for example, as would some abstract concept like democracy. So these are intended to be applicable, these queries that we ask people, across all possible concepts that you can think of, and not just noun concepts, but also verb and adjective concepts. So some of them have to do with more abstract kinds of experiences involving space and time, social experiences, emotional experiences, and so on. And this is how we get the ratings. We assign a word to a person. In this case, it was the word chair. We define what we mean by chair. Chair has actually multiple meanings. It can be a piece of furniture. It can be the person leading a committee. You know, it has many different meanings. So we specify the sense that we're interested in. And then we ask a query. For example, this one is about pain. To what degree do you think of this thing as being associated with pain or physical discomfort? And then we give them a high rating example, headache, a medium rating example, and then we ask them for their rating. So this is how it works. And a person signs on to the crowdsourcing site, they're assigned a word, and they answer 65 questions about that word that cover all of those experiential dimensions. We so far have collected 2.5 million ratings, which is, you know, it's a big data set from over 38,000 raters. We have full ratings on that many words. And this is what the vectors look like. I've arranged the 65 features around the radius of the circle. And the distance from the center of the circle reflects the rating value, goes from 0 to 6. And what you can see here is the average ratings for each feature for all of the animals that we've collected ratings on. So biological motion, we call it biomotion. The query is something like, to what extent does this object show motion like an animal? So obviously the ratings are going to be high for animals, not so high for fruits and vegetables, for example. Yeah, so that's how it works. And different categories, and this is a key point of the talk today, different categories have systematically different mean vectors because they are experienced in very different ways. So if you compare animals to the one for tools that's in the middle of the bottom row, you can see that there are many different differences between how we experience animals and how we experience tools. This is what the model dissimilarity matrix looks like for 300 nouns that we initially collected data on. We've since, as you saw, expanded that data set quite a bit. And you can see that, and these concepts are grouped by a priori category assignment that we did. But you can see that along that diagonal, they form clusters of similar objects. And in fact, we can use these vectors and do a cluster analysis, like a k-means or a hierarchical clustering analysis, and get out the a priori categories quite nicely. The ratings, I don't fully understand it, but they even distinguish between aquatic animals and land animals. And I don't even know for sure why that is. All right, so remember about RSA. RSA requires you to take neural activation patterns from a region in the brain. It can be the whole brain. It can be a region of interest. In this case, we're doing searchlight RSA, which means we take a patch, and our method is surface-based rather than volume-based. So we take a patch of the cortical surface and compute all the activation values within that patch for the full set of 300 items. And that gives us the neural dissimilarity matrix. And we compare that to the model dissimilarity matrix to get a score for that patch that's assigned to the vertex point at the center of the patch. And then we just do that, moving the patch across the entire cortical surface. Is that clear? Everything sort of clear? All right, so we're going to try to use this approach to adjudicate between these models. What would this hub and spoke model predict? I think it would predict that there should be no correspondence with the 65-dimensional model anywhere in the brain. And the reason I say that is because the amodal hub doesn't preserve any experiential information. Those representations are said to be amodal. And the spokes, these circles outside the hub, only contain information about one kind of experience, one modality of experience. So the dissimilarity matrix, which captures the content across all modalities of experience, is not going to be very similar to any kind of modality-specific dissimilarity matrix. And I hope that's clear. The prediction from the hub and spoke model really is that an RSA like this, done with a 65-dimensional multimodal model, should not show much. There might be some area of the brain that shows enough multimodality convergence to show up something, but not much. Our model predicts that most of the semantic system, at least the higher levels of it, should be representing multimodal information. Well, this is the result, and you can see that it's much more similar to the convergence zone model. You see two brain maps here because there were two different data sets that we analyzed, but the experiment 1 data set was a little larger than experiment 2, but the overall results are very consistent across the two studies. And this is, in red here, is the overlap between the two studies. So what you're seeing here is that most of the semantic network, the conceptual representational network, including most of the frontal lobe, encodes multimodal experience, the same kind of experience information that's encoded in the model. That's what the analysis is designed to do, is to detect areas in the brain where that kind of information is encoded. Okay, so we think of these as probably multimodal convergence zones. Okay, so we talked a little bit about theories of concept encoding. Experiential is the one listed here in the middle, and we use this model we call CREA, which refers to concept representation as experiential abstraction. Taxonomic models basically represent concepts according to their position in a taxonomical hierarchy. And I referred to WordNet before, and that's the one that we're going to use here to compare the experiential model with. I don't have time to go into distributional models, but maybe some folks in the audience are familiar with Word2Vec, GLOVE, LSA, HAL. There are various kinds of models that express content as a vector of embeddings that reflect how similar, or the language context in which a word occurs. So it sometimes is measured as a function of the words that tend to occur around a word within a large corpus of data language. It's sometimes computed, as in, I think Word2Vec does this, as a prediction model for what word is likely to come next. But in any case, what it mainly captures is the degree of similarity between one word and another. So we can definitely use it for RSA analysis. I think I'm going to skip over this. It just shows that the similarity structure is a little different for these models. For example, in word use patterns there at the bottom, these distribution models, table, plate, and spatula are going to be used more often together and more similarly than the word frisbee. In an experiential model, frisbee might be closer to plate because they have very similar shapes. Who knows? And so on. So this study by Leo Fernandino tried to evaluate the correspondence between those three kinds of models and the brain activity patterns using RSA. So he compared CREA, two versions of it actually, one reduced to 48 dimensions. And that's because Leo doesn't like some of the dimensions in the model, frankly. So he took some out. And another one reduced to just 8 basic sensory motor features. WordNet was the taxonomic model. We also developed categorical models, just grouping concepts into categories. So they had values of 0 or 1 for each category. And then we computed the vector correlations, and 2 distributional models. He used the general semantic network that we defined in that meta-analysis that I showed you initially. So what he's going to do is not a searchlight RSA in this case. What he's going to do is take all the voxel activations within all these red areas and compute the neural dissimilarity matrices from those. So just to recap, subjects see a list of 300, 320 words. We get the activation patterns within that ROI, and we construct a neural dissimilarity matrix based on that. So that's the ground truth, and we want to know which model dissimilarity matrix is most like that one. So here's model dissimilarity matrices using WordNet in the upper left. You can see that there's some structure there. We had 8, in this example, 8 different categories of concepts. The top 4 are object categories, the bottom 4 are event categories. And you can see there's some structure there for sure. The experiential model that I talked about before shows a different kind of structure, although they're correlated. If you do a point-to-point correlation between these models, they're significantly correlated, somewhere in the range of 0.4 to 0.6, depending on what the model is. And on the far right, you see the correlation, the dissimilarity matrix for the word-to-vec model. And there's the neural dissimilarity matrix from this data set, the actual neural dissimilarity matrix. You're tempted to say there's nothing there. I mean, it looks like there's very little structure in that neural dissimilarity matrix, but there is some. And it's obscured because the signals are very noisy, frankly. The signal to noise ratio in fMRI is not very high. So what we want to do is correlations with each of these kinds of model dissimilarity matrices to see which is most correlated with the neural similarity structure. I hope that's clear. This is a new development in fMRI. It's a way to use fMRI signals to actually adjudicate between different theoretical models, which a lot of brain imaging has been criticized for being sort of atheoretical and not bearing much on our understanding at a theoretical model level. I mean, it's one thing to be able to map something to a particular brain location. It's another thing to say what information is actually represented at that brain location and why is it represented there. All right, so these are the results. So the bars reflect the RSA value, the correlation between the brain and the model for each of these 6 models. And you can see it was highest for the experiential model with 48 features. And that was significantly higher than all the other models. But the other models are not, they're also significant. That's what the little 3 stars at the bottom of each bar mean. Question is, why are they significant? Does that mean that there's also non-experiential information represented in the brain? We don't think so. Remember that all these models are correlated with each other. And that's just a natural property of reality. For example, the structure in the experiential model is due to the types of experiences that define concepts. But those types of experiences also lead to us putting different objects in different categories. So for example, musical instruments is a category of object, and we experience them mostly through sound. So there's a correlation there between the category assignment and the type of experience that sort of underlies the category assignment. And it's systematic, and it leads to correlations between the models. So what Leo did here was to do a partial correlation instead of just a simple correlation, where he regressed out the contribution from each of the models to look at what was left over. And the only model that showed explanatory value after the other models were taken out was this experiential model. So we conclude from this that the other models explain brain activation patterns only to the extent that they're correlated with the experiential, that they don't contribute anything above and beyond the experiential. And you can see this in another way. So I showed you in the first study, I went through the searchlight RSA results for the 65-dimensional model, which is shown in an unthresholded version on the left here, and running the same analysis, but with a distribution model. And there's no place in the brain where the RSA correlation is stronger for the distribution model. It's everywhere a little bit weaker. Okay. So patterns of neural activity within the semantic network are best predicted by an experiential model of conceptual content. So an embodied model, a grounded model. Non-experiential models like taxonomic models and distributional models explain neural activity only to the extent that they are correlated with the experiential model. They don't provide any additional independent explanatory value. Experiential content is represented even at the highest levels of the conceptual store. So this is new. This was news to us. We were thinking, at least some of us were thinking of these very high level convergence areas as being very abstract and not preserving much modality specific information, but it turns out that they do. They don't appear to have amodal or symbolic representations at all. So this is another way to look at it. This is kind of a schematization of the hub and spoke model where you have an amodal hub that's got symbolic representations where maybe each one of these squares corresponds to a different concept. Like maybe the one here highlighted is rhinoceros. And then it connects, if you need to know what a rhinoceros looks like, you can activate some of the shape information that's stored in the unimodal visual cortex. So that's the way the hub and spoke model is conceived. You've got strictly unimodal information in the spokes connected to the hubs, which are amodal or symbolic. This is what we think is much more likely to be the case, which is that unimodal modality-specific information is preserved all the way up into the multimodal cortex. There are no amodal conceptual representations. The representation of a concept, in this case, maybe giraffe or something like that, I don't know why I'm thinking about big animals today, but is represented throughout the network in all of its multimodal glory. And the multimodal modality-specific representations are stored even in multimodal cortex. So yeah, if you have to activate the, let's say, the color of an object and visualize its color, what happens is that the color representations in the multimodal cortex feed back into lower level cortices that contain more of the sensory detail. What's stored at the multimodal level is something like color is very important for this thing, but not maybe the details of the color itself. And to get those, to retrieve those kinds of sensory details requires top-down activation of lower level perceptual cortices, which I've shown here as kind of fading in terms of the intensity of the color to represent that this activation of lower level perceptual cortices is not constant. It depends on the task demands and the condition of the subject at the moment. Okay, I'm running out of time. I'll try to get through this quickly. We're interested in different categories of concepts. So a very salient distinction is between event concepts and object concepts. So event concepts are represented in language mostly by verbs and verb phrases, but there are some nouns that also refer to events encapsulated as concepts. I've given some examples here. So we had 160 event nouns and 160 object nouns in this experiment that were carefully matched on all the things we could think of matching them on, including lexical decision reaction time and naming out loud the word reaction time. We know that these kinds of nouns have differential representation in the brain from this study from Maria Bedney, where she did the same kind of contrast. And in the green areas, you can see where the event nouns activated the brain more than the object nouns. This map does not show the converse, but I'll show you that in a minute. All right, so why are event and object representations located in different brain regions? This is the central question. One possible explanation is the brain is just arranged by category. So you put the events over here, you put the objects over here. Maybe you break up the objects into different kinds of categories. So that would look like something here. Like if this category 1 was events, this is the brain area that would get activated, right? If category 2 is objects, that would be activated, and so on. So that's the modular view of how categories are organized in the brain. So we want to ask whether that's necessarily true. Can experiential account that we've been talking about all this time explain category-related differences in the brain? In other words, is the organizing principle the category, or is it the set of features? That's the question. We hypothesize that categories vary systematically in their experiential content. There's no doubt that that's the case. The musical instruments example I pointed out before. Musical instruments make sounds. Tomatoes do not make sounds. Different categories of things result in different kinds of experiential content. And if we also then assume that brain regions represent different kinds of experiential information slightly differently, like the experiential information content is not the same in every brain locations. If we assume that it's not, then maybe the interaction of these two variables explains why some categories are over here and some categories are over there. So that would look like this. Imagine these shapes now are not categories, but they're different kinds of features. So the squares being action, content, etc., sound content. And they're mixed, they're not segregated very tightly. They're everywhere, there's all three. But yet a concept of one category can have a different mixture of these different kinds of content. So this particular concept has a high action content and a lower sound content, shape content. And here's a concept with a different mixture. Same representations underlying everything, but the engagement of those representations is different depending on the experiential content of the concept. So you can see how the activation shifts a little bit. All right, so objects and events differ in their experiential content. These are the 65 features in the PRIA model. The red dots are object concept ratings, the blue ones are event concept ratings, and the little asterisks is going down are showing you where at corrected 0.01, the ratings differ reliably between these categories. Most of the features are reliably different. So it's intuitively obvious that a concept like Apple is going to have very different experiential content than a concept like rodeo, right? I mean, those are very different kinds of ontological entities. All right, so this study was led by our student, Dr. now, Tong, and is under review at the moment. But the questions were, can experiential content predict event-object activation differences? And if so, is it necessarily the case that the same underlying features are predicting both categories? So we replicated the Bedney study, and this is the map that we got. 160 events compared to 160 object nouns. You can see the in red and yellow, the areas that are more activated by event concepts are along the superior temporal sulcus into the lower parietal lobe. There's some lateral occipital cortex activation that we don't understand. And then there's an IFG focus, more activated by events. And then all the blue areas are more activated by object concepts in general, but there's a lot of variation within each of the category, but this is the general result. And it's very similar to this follow-up study that Bedney's lab did a few years ago looking at verbs versus nouns. So verbs are more or less event concepts, right? So here they compared verbs to nouns, not events to objects, but most of the nouns in this study were objects. So I'll just toggle between those. They get the same weird left lateral occipital cortex activation for verbs for some reason. We're not clear about why this is happening because in both studies, the stimuli in the categories were very matched for all the visual properties. So it's difficult to understand, but very similar kinds of results here. All right, so are they represented by a common experiential code? And I'll show you how we test this hypothesis. It's called voxel-wise encoding. So this is another very powerful technique that's just come along in the fMRI world in the last 10 years or so. So again, we have brain maps for 300 words, in this case, 320 words. And we selected some of them to train a ridge regression model. So we take the activations in a particular voxel. This is all done one voxel at a time. We take the activations across 320 words. We also know what the features are for each of those 320 words. So vision, dark, arousal, for example. And so we use ridge regression, simple regression model, to predict what are the beta value, well, not predict, to try to estimate what are the beta values that would predict the activation value for that voxel. I hope that's clear. It's a simple multi-regression model. There's so many variables in the model, 65 in this case, and they're collinear with each other to some degree that we use ridge regression to deal with that problem. The beta values you can think of as capturing the sensitivity of that voxel to that feature. And the final activation value of the voxel is the weighted sum of all those features. And that's cool because once you have a model, then you can predict what the activation values would be for unseen, untrained stimuli. So those are the test concepts. You simply take the beta values and multiply them by the feature weights for each of the concepts, and that gives you an estimate of what the predicted activation for that in that voxel would be for each test concept. I hope that makes sense. This is called voxel-wise encoding model. You can then use those values to do a number of different things. You can create a whole activation map across the whole brain, just do these ridge regressions in each voxel for each concept. You can average those to get a mean activation value for a set of concepts. It's a very powerful technique for making predictions. So we're interested in whether the underlying features that represent events and objects are the same features. The way to do that is to train the model on event concepts, for example, and try to predict the activation values for object concepts. And vice versa, train on the object concepts and try to predict the event concept activations. If that works, it only could work if the underlying feature set was the same for both. The values don't have to be the same, but the underlying features have to be the features for both kinds of concepts. Otherwise, this kind of training prediction model would not work. And we did that separately for voxels in the event network and in the object network. So If so, training an encoding model with either object or event neural data should predict activation patterns for the other category. So we're going to train with events, predict objects, train with objects, predict events in both networks. And if we get a significantly above zero correspondence between the observed and the predicted activation values, this indicates that the hypothesis is correct. And that's what happens. So all of these bars are highly significant. And they show that, yes, you can use neural data from objects, combine it with a model, a feature-based model, ridge regression, and you can predict activation values from a completely different categorical set of concepts. It's strong evidence, I think, that the underlying conceptual representation uses the same feature set across even ontologically different categories like objects and events. So we think the same thing will apply to different object subcategories. We're working on those analyses at the moment. Another way to show this is to just, as I said before, you can predict the average activation map for objects, even not using any object activation data. You can predict what that map will look like just from the events. So we trained on the object maps to predict the event maps and trained on the event maps to predict the object maps and contrasted those to predict the observed difference map. So this is I showed you before the thresholded version of this difference map. Here's the unthresholded version, because when we're looking at predictions, we want to look across the whole range of predicted values. And this is the predicted map. So it's striking to me that many of the features of the observed map are replicated in the predicted data, and it's not using any of the actual neural data to construct this map. It's using predictions that are purely model-based. So what it basically means is that in many brain areas, maybe not all, correlation here was 0.46, but in many brain areas, the difference between events and objects is predicted purely by the differences in their experiential content. Okay. I said most of this already, but the activation patterns for object concepts can be predicted from event concept activation patterns and vice versa. This is true even in regions that seem specialized for one category over the other. Both networks contain information about both categories is another way of saying that. The results strongly suggest a common set of representations underlying all types of concepts. Category-related differences in activation arise from systematic differences in experiential content between categories and differential representation of these features across the cortex. I hope that makes sense. I have one last topic that I'll try to buzz through, and this is about body part concepts. We have 5 different concrete object categories in our data sets, and body concepts, body part concepts is one of them. It's a disputed area in clinical neuroscience. When you see semantic deficits, oftentimes patients aren't as affected in their knowledge about body parts. Body parts are often relatively spared. At the same time, there's this syndrome called somatotopagnosia, also called autotopagnosia, in which you give a patient a body part name and they can't show you where it is in the body. So they've lost their ability to at least spatially locate the body part. There's also this phenomenon called the extrastriate body areas that comes to us from functional imaging data. The red areas here are the extrastriate body area, and the other one discovered later is the fusiform body area underneath the brain. So there's selectivity in the brain, at least to body pictures, body part pictures, like there's a fusiform face area and a parahippocampal place area. So we looked at these categories using the data sets that we have in 38 participants, 50 items from each of these 4 categories matched on all kinds of variables. So these are pairwise contrast, just plain, simple, standard univariate contrast between on the top body parts in animals, showing where body parts produce more activation, body parts versus tools, and body parts versus plants, foods. And this is a conjunction map of the three contrasts. So in these areas, body parts show stronger activations. Remember, this is just a standard univariate contrast with stronger activations than the other three categories. Okay. So these are regions that seem to preferentially represent body part categories. And remember, these are not pictures of body parts. These are words that refer to body parts. So this is not, can't be explained by like visual differences between body parts and other kinds of objects. It's interesting, these days we use this HCP parcellation to refer to where areas are activated. And there's a very good correspondence between the posterior MTG activation here and this parcel called PHT, and also some of the parietal parcels in the supramarginal gyrus, and one in the rostral precentral, inferior precentral sulcus called 6R, right up here. Yeah, so this is also data in C here. This is data from the HCP. So the HCP data set is a huge data set, and one piece of it was having people look at pictures of different objects. So what's shown here in the yellow areas are the areas, the extrastriate body area, basically, that responded more to pictures of body parts than pictures of other kinds of things. And what we did here in D was we took our results, which come from word, selected body part responses for words, and we overlaid it on the image map from HCP. And it's interesting that the selective word activations are a little anterior to the extrastriate body area here. And they're a little further away from the visual cortex. And here they're a little further away from the somatosensory cortex. So it seems to suggest a hierarchical processing stream. This is a map of connectivity in the brain using the PHT and the HCP resting state data set. This is the network of areas that are connected to PHT. So they include the supramarginal gyrus, PF, PFOP, and that lower precentral sulcus region. So this seems to be a very cohesive network for representing body concepts. This is voxel-wise encoding before, and what we're going to do is use non-body part concepts, no body parts involved. We're going to use the neural activations from those in a ridge regression model to predict the activations to body parts. And once we have the predicted activations in each voxel, we're going to make a predicted body part activation map and compare it to other categories. So again, this is similar to what we did before with events and objects. On the left side, you see the observed map, contrasting body parts with all other kinds of concepts. And here's the experiential prediction in the middle column and a prediction that we did with word2vec. And again, the differences between categories are fairly well predicted just by these ridge regression models. All right, so body part concepts are preferentially represented in a distributed left lateralized network that includes these areas. I didn't mention also the pars triangularis of the IFG. And this preferential representation is predicted by differences in experiential content and differential representation of concept categories in the brain, we think, reflects local variation in experiential information representation. Sorry, I went over a little bit there. I won't be offended if people need to leave, but I'm very eager to answer any questions, clear up any confusions, whatever.
Yeah, we have a little time for questions. I would suggest let's start in the room. We have questions online too, but I've already promised folks that I will send you the questions, Jeff, if we don't get to them.
Go for it, Willie. as the talk that I saw in 2010, this is a master class, so thank you. It's very exciting
thank you very much. That's nice.
See all this stuff. So when I was at Irvine, there were people that were doing sensory cortex mapping using this traveling wave technique.
Yeah.
Right. So they were doing visual and auditory field mapping.
Cool.
And the visual field mapping results, what they discovered is like you get retinatopic mass in V1, like you've known for forever, but you see retinotopy throughout the brain, in fact. I mean, not just the visual cortex,
Yeah, a
but
lot
throughout
of
the brain.
parietal cortex.
Right.
Even some frontal areas.
Right. So this is Brian Barton and Elisa Brewer at Irvine, right? So it was very interesting because it was like, it reminds me of what you're talking about, because it was like these higher level areas that we associate with more abstract processes, they were claiming there's still this preservation of the retinotopic organization, which they thought was important to the mechanisms in those areas. Even though, so it seems very congruent with what you're
That's
presenting.
a cool result. I mean, we don't fully understand how much sensory detail is still preserved as you go up the hierarchy. We just don't know.
Right.
I mean, probably single unit studies in animal brains is probably the best source for working.
But an interesting wrinkle to this is that this is using the traveling wave technique. When they did a different task that required the subject to do something more interesting, then they showed that the retinotopy disappeared in some of these areas, right? So that these higher level areas show this retinotopic organization, but if they have to do something deeper with the stimulus, then they lose the preservation of the retinotopic mass, which they were trying to explain via some kind of like rapid plasticity, something or other. But to me, it called a bit into question whether there's some other explanation for the propagation of the retinotopy. If that's just because of the connectivity of these areas, but it's not really, wasn't really important to the function. That's my question to you.
You know, the same thing was shown decades ago in cat auditory cortex. If you have an anesthetized cat, the tonotopic patterns are much more clear than when the cat's awake.
Right.
And the explanation there is not rapid plasticity, it's more about feedback input to the auditory cortex from higher centers. Just kind of scrambling up the activations patterns in the auditory cortex. Scrambling up is not a technical term, it's influencing them.
So I guess my question is, would you expect these results to be different if you had subjects then, comprehending a sentence, like matching a sentence to a picture, but then you're looking at the word level activations?
Yeah.
Would you expect the same level of, sort of multimodal preservation, or would you expect it to also drop off?
I think I would expect much the same pattern. I mean, this was not a very deep semantic processing task, but neither is that one, matching a word.
Well, sure. I'm trying to think of something, what it would be.
Yeah. We tried to avoid any kind of, specific judgments because we thought it would influence the activation patterns. Like, you don't want to ask somebody what color something is, or even is it pleasant or unpleasant, because that's going to influence the pattern of activation across these multimodal units. So we adopted something kind of neutral. How familiar are you with it? Which still might influence the pattern. But it's not a difficult task. We get like 99% response rates. Some people, it's not like they puzzle over it for a long time. But I think all of the in fMRI, brain activation depends on the task. Brain activation patterns depend on the task.
Any other questions from our meeting?
Can you talk a little bit about how the brain might distinguish between, within category, two very similar, for example, or so like horse and camel, and how that plays into this body of work?
So I think that those activation patterns should be very similar because actually horse and camel, when we took our original 65-dimensional ratings for all those words, horse and camel were both in the data set. And when we did the hierarchical clustering of everything, horse and camel were on their own little tree branch. Because they have similar size, they're both used for travel, they have just lots of experiential similarities. So in that case, the neural activation patterns are going to be very different, and yet the concept of horse and camel are very different, right? So how does the brain deal with that? You know, I think of it as kind of like the idea of an attractor state. Over time, over experience. So first of all, let's say little kids often, as they're learning concepts, do confuse things like that. They confuse even cats with dogs. As they get more experience, the brain develops what we call attractor states in neural network parlance, where you can't exist between two states that are known to the network. The network activations, because the nodes interact with each other, they inhibit each other, and the overall activation pattern in the network drifts toward a certain pattern that is a familiar one that the network's seen before. And it's just a result of tuning of the connections between the nodes. It's called an attractor state, and I think that accounts for that sort of phenomenon accounts for our ability to tell between very similar objects. But you know, it depends on how similar and how much experience you've had with them. So if they're very similar objects and you're not an expert, you know, an expert in goats would say that's a particular kind of goat, that's a completely different kind of goat, and you're like, they're both goats. You know, so it's a function of the degree of similarity and the degree of experience with discriminating between them.
I think we're going to have to end it here because we're going to have to leave the room. There's a class starting in 5 minutes.
Oh, well, we've got 5
Thank you.
minutes then.
Thank you so much. Great.